The Second Battle of Smolensk was a Soviet strategic offensive operation conducted by the Red Army as part of the Summer-Autumn Campaign of 1943. Staged almost simultaneously with the Lower Dnieper offensive, the offensive lasted 2 months and was led by General Andriy Eremenko, commanding the Kalinin Front, and Vasily Sokolovsky, commanding the Western Front. Its goal was to clear the German presence from the Smolensk and Bryansk regions. Smolensk had been under German occupation since the First Battle of Smolensk in 1941. Despite an impressive German defense, the Red Army was able to stage several breakthroughs, liberating several major cities, including Smolensk and Roslavel. As a result of this operation, the Red Army was able to start planning for the liberation of Belarus. However, the overall advance was quite modest and slow in the face of heavy German resistance, and the operation was therefore accomplished in 3 stages: 7 the 20th of August, 21 August, 6 September, and 7 September 2 October. Although playing a major military role in its own right, the Smolensk operation was also important for its effect on the Battle of the Dnieper. It has been estimated that as many as 55 German divisions were committed to counter the Smolensk operation, divisions which would have been critical to prevent Soviet troops from crossing the Dnieper in the south. In the course of the operation, the Red Army also definitively drove back German forces from the Smolensk land bridge, historically the most important approach for a Western attack on Moscow. The strategic operations included smaller operations: Sparse de Mengsk Offensive Operation Dukovshkone Demidov Offensive Operation Yelnya Dorogo Buj Offensive Operation Dukovshkone Demidov Offensive, Operation Smolensk Roslavel Offensive Operation Bryansk Offensive Operation. Strategic context. By the end of the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Germany had lost all hope of regaining the initiative on the Eastern Front. Losses were considerable, and the whole army was less effective than before, as many of its experienced soldiers had fallen during the previous 2 years of fighting. This left the German army capable of only reacting to Soviet moves. On the Soviet side, Stalin was determined to pursue the liberation of occupied territories from German control, a course of action that had its first major success at the end of 1942 with Operation Uranus, which led to the liberation of Stalingrad. The Battle of the Dnieper was to achieve the liberation of Ukraine and push the southern part of the front towards the west, in order to weaken the German defenses even further. However, the Smolensk operation was staged simultaneously, in a move that would also draw German reserves north, thereby weakening the German defense on the southern part of the front. Both operations were part of the same strategic offensive plan, aiming to recover as much Soviet territory from German control as possible. 30 years later, Marshal Vasilevsky wrote in his memoirs, "This plan, enormous both in regard of its daring and of forces committed to it, was executed through several operations: the Smolensk operation, the Donbass operation, the Left Bank Ukraine operation." Geography. The territory on which the offensive was to be staged was a slightly hilly plain covered with ravines and possessing significant areas of swamps and forests that restricted military movement. Its most important hills reached heights over 270 meters, allowing for improved artillery defense. In 1943, the area was for the most part covered with pine and mixed forests and thick bushes. Numerous rivers also passed through the area, the most important of them being the Donets Basin, Western Dvina, Dnieper, Desna, Volost, and Ugra rivers. None of these rivers were especially wide at 10 to 120 meters respectively, nor deep at 40 to 250 centimeters respectively, but the surrounding wide, swamp-like areas proved difficult to cross, especially for mechanized troops. Moreover, like many south-flowing rivers in Europe, the Dnieper's western bank, which was held by German troops, was higher and steeper than the eastern. There were very few available bridges or ferries. transport infrastructure for the Soviet troops. The offensive was further complicated by a lack of transport in the area in which the offensive was to be staged. The road network was not well developed and paved roads were rare. After rainfall, which was quite common during the Russian summer, most of them were turned into mud, greatly slowing down any advance of mechanized troops, and raising logistical issues as well. The only major railroad access available for Soviet troops was the RZHEV Vyazma-Kirov line. The Wehrmacht controlled a much widened network of roads and railroads, centered on Smolensk and Roslavel. These two cities were important logistical centers, allowing quick supply and reinforcements for German troops. By far the most important railroads for German troops were the Smolensk-Bryansk axis and the Nevelosha-Mogilev axis, linking German Western troops with troops concentrated around Ural. As part of the Soviet planning, the German railroad communications were attacked by the partisans during the conduct of Operation Concert, one of the largest railroad sabotage operations of World War II. Opposing forces. Soviet offensive sector. In July 1943, the Soviet front line on this part of the Eastern Front was a concave with a re-entrant around Ural. The re-entrant exposed the Wehrmacht to flank attacks from the north, but the offensive, the main attack carried out Kalinin and Western fronts, would be quite difficult. The Kalinin front had assigned for the operation the 10th Guards RMY, 5th Army, 10th Army, 21st Army, 33rd Army, 49th Army, 68th RMY, 1st Air Army, 2nd Guards Tank Corps, 5th Mechanized Corps, 6th Guards Cavalry Corps. The Western Front would have for the operation the 4th Shock Army, 39th Army, 43rd Army, 3rd Air Army, 31st Army. German defenses. As a result of the shape of the front, a significant number of divisions of Army Group Center were kept on this part of the front because of a fear of a major offensive in this sector. For instance, at the end of July 1943, a German staff briefing stated, "On the front held by the Army Group Center, many signs show a continuous preparation to a yet limited offensive and of a maneuver of a mobilization of the Army Group Center." The front had been more or less stable for 4 to 5 months before the battle, and possessed geographical features favorable for a strong defensive setup. Thus, German forces had time to build extensive defensive positions, numbering as much as 5 or 6 defensive lines in some places, for a total depth extending from 100 to 130 kilometers. The first defensive zone included the first and the second defense lines, for a total depth of 12 to 15 kilometers, and located, whenever possible, on elevated ground. The main defense line, 5 kilometers deep, possessed 3 sets of trenches and firing points, linked by an extensive communication network. The density of firing points reached 6 or 7 per kilometer of front line. In some places, where heavy tank attacks were feared, the third set of trenches was in fact a solid anti-tank moat with a steep western side integrating artillery and machine guns emplacements. The forward edge of the battle area was protected by 3 lines of barbed wire and a solid wall of minefields. The second defense zone, located about 10 kilometers behind the outer defense zone and covering the most important directions, was composed of a set of firing points connected with trenches. It was protected with barbed wire, and also with minefields in some places where heavy tank offensives were anticipated. Between the outer and the second defense zones, a set of small firing points and garrisons was also created in order to slow down a Soviet advance should the Red Army break through the outer defense zone. Behind the second zone, heavy guns were positioned. Finally, deep behind the front line, 3 or 4 more defense lines were located, whenever possible, on the western shore of a river. For instance, important defense lines were set up on the western side of the Dnieper and Desna. Additionally, the main urban centers located on the defense line were reinforced and fortified, preparing them for a potentially long fight. Roads were mined and covered with anti-tank devices, and firing points were installed in the most important and tallest buildings. First stage. Main breakthrough. After a day of probing, the goal of which was to determine whether German troops would choose to withdraw or not from the first set of trenches. The offensive started on 7 August 1943 at 6:30 with a breakthrough towards Roslavel. Three armies were committed to this offensive: the 5th Army, the 10th Guards Army, and the 33rd Army. The attack quickly encountered heavy opposition and stalled. German troops attempted numerous counterattacks from their well-prepared defense positions, supported by tanks, assault guns, and the fire of heavy guns and mortars. As Konstantin Rokossovsky recalls, "We literally had to tear ourselves through German lines, one by one." On the first day, the Soviet troops advanced only 4 kilometers, with all available troops committed to battle. Despite violent Soviet attacks, it quickly became obvious that the three armies would not be able to get through the German lines. Soviet commanders decided therefore to commit the 68th Army, kept in reserve, to battle. On the German side, 3 additional divisions were sent to the front from the Ural sector to try to stop the Soviet advance. The attack resumed the following day with another attempt at a simultaneous breakthrough taking place further north, towards Yartsevo. Both attacks were stopped in the tracks by heavy German resistance. In the following 5 days, Soviet troops slowly made their way through German defenses, repelling heavy counterattacks and sustaining heavy losses. By feeding reserve troops to battle, the Red Army managed to advance to a depth varying from 15 to 25 kilometers by the 11th of August. Subsequent attacks by the armored and cavalry forces of the 6th Guards Cavalry Corps had no further effect and resulted in heavy casualties because of strong German defenses, leading to a stalemate. Sparse de Mengsk offensive. During the Sparse de Mengsk offensive operation in the region of Sparse de Mengsk, things went better for the 10th Army. The Wehrmacht had fewer troops and only limited reserves in this area, enabling the 10th Army to break through German lines and advance 10 kilometers in 2 days. The 5th Mechanized Corps, relocated from Kirov and committed to battle in order to exploit the breakthrough, failed in its mission, mainly because a poorly organized anti-aircraft defense enabled Luftwaffe dive bombers to attack its light Valentine tanks with some impunity. The Corps sustained heavy losses and had to pull away from combat. Soviet troops eventually advanced a further 25 kilometers as of 13 August, liberating Sparse de Mengsk. Dukovshkone offensive. As ordered by the Statute, the Dukovshkone Demidov offensive operation near Dukovshkone started almost a week later, on 13 August. As on other parts of the front, the 39th Army and the 43rd Army encountered serious opposition. During the first day alone, Wehrmacht troops attempted 24 regimental-sized counterattacks, supported by tanks, assault guns, and aviation. Soviet troops managed to advance only 6 to 7 kilometers over the next 5 days, although they inflicted heavy casualties on Wehrmacht troops. Their own losses were also heavy. Causes of the stalemate. By mid-August, Soviet operations all along the Smolensk front stabilized. The resulting stalemate, while not a defeat per se, was stinging for Soviet commanders, who provided several explanations for their failure to press forward. Deputy Chief of General Staff General A.I. Antonov reported, "We have to deal both with forests and swamps and with increasing resistance of enemy troops reinforced by divisions arriving from Bryansk region," while Marshal Nikolai Voronov, formerly a Statute member, analyzed the stalemate in his memoirs, publishing what he saw as the 8 primary causes. The Wehrmacht OKH command knew about the operation and was prepared for it. Wehrmacht defense lines were exceptionally well prepared. Several Red Army rifle divisions were insufficiently prepared to perform an assault of a multi-line defense setup. This was especially true for reserve divisions, whose training was not always properly supervised. There were not enough tanks committed to battle, forcing Red Army commanders to rely on artillery, mortars, and infantry to break through Wehrmacht lines. Moreover, numerous counterattacks and an abundance of minefields slowed down the infantry's progress. The interaction between regiments and divisions was far from perfect. There were unexpected pauses during the attack and a strong will of some regiments to hide from the attack and expose another regiment. Many Red Army commanders were too impressed by Wehrmacht counterattacks and failed to act properly. Even if their own troops outnumbered those of the Wehrmacht, the infantry were not using their own weapons well enough. They relied too much on artillery. The fact that the offensive was postponed from 3 to 7 August gave German troops more time to increase their readiness. With all these factors considered, Voronov demanded that the 4th Tank Army and the 8th Artillery Corps be transferred from the Bryansk front and instead committed to support the attack near Smolensk. The stalemate was far from what had been desired by the Statue, but it had at least one merit. It tied down as much as 40% of all Wehrmacht divisions on the Eastern Front near Smolensk, making the task for troops fighting in the south and near Kursk much easier. The Statue planned to resume the offensive on the 21st of August, but decided to postpone it slightly to give Soviet units time to resupply and reinforce. Second stage. By mid-August, the situation on the Eastern Front had changed as the Red Army started a general offensive, beginning with the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive operation and the Orlov offensive operation, otherwise known as the Battle of Kursk, and continuing with the Wehrmacht's defensive Battle of the Dnieper Line in North Ukraine. Nevertheless, the Wehrmacht command was still reinforcing its troops around Smolensk and Roslavel, withdrawing several divisions from the Oryol region. As a result, the two Soviet counter-offensives that followed the Kursk defensive operation proceeded relatively easily for the Red Army around Oryol, creating a large salient south of Smolensk and Bryansk. In this situation, the former attack axis, directed southwest towards Roslavel and Bryansk, became useless. The Statue decided instead to shift the attack axis west to Yelnya and Smolensk. Yelnya offensive. The Yelnya-Dorogobush offensive operation was considered the key to Smolensk, and Wehrmacht troops created a massive fortified, defensive position around the city. Swampy areas on the Desna and Ugra rivers were mined and heavy guns set up on hills overlooking the city. The Soviet armies, aware of the Wehrmacht preparations, were reinforced with tanks and artillery during the week from 20 to 27 August. The offensive finally commenced on the 28th of August by the 10th Guards Army, 21st Army and the 33rd Army, supported by 3 tank corps, a mechanized corps and the 1st Air Army. These 4 armies were covering a front of only 36 kilometers, creating a very high concentration of troops. The troops, however, had fuel and supplies for 2 weeks at most. Soviet troops moved forward after an intense 90-minute shelling. The artillery bombardment as well as ground attack aircraft significantly damaged Wehrmacht lines, allowing the Red Army to execute a breakthrough on a 25 km sector front and advance 6 to 8 km by the end of the day. The following day, the 29th of August, Red Army rifle divisions advanced further, creating a salient 30 km wide and 12 to 15 km deep. In order to exploit the breakthrough, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps was thrown into the battle. In one day, its troops advanced 30 kilometers and reached the outskirts of Yelnya, leaving Wehrmacht troops no time to regroup their forces. Red Army troops attacked the city and started to form an encirclement. On the 30th of August, Wehrmacht forces were forced to abandon Yelnya, sustaining heavy casualties. This commenced a full-scale retreat by Wehrmacht troops from the area. By the 3rd of September, Soviet forces had reached the eastern shore of the Dnieper. Bryansk maneuver. Near Bryansk, things went equally well for the Soviet armies, despite heavy German resistance. However, an identified weakness changed all the previous plans. A surprisingly easy capture of several hills commanding the Dubrovka region north of Bryansk, with numerous German soldiers captured in total absence of battle readiness, came to the attention of General Markian Popov, commander of the Bryansk front from June to October 1943. This meant that the Soviet offensive was probably not expected along that particular axis. Therefore, the boundary between the First Belarusian Front and the Western Front was shifted south, and two new armies executed a single pincer movement to Dubrovka and around Bryansk, forcing German forces to withdraw. By the 6th of September, the offensive slowed down almost to a halt on the entire front, with Soviet troops advancing only 2 kilometers each day. On the right flank, heavy fighting broke out in the woods near Yartsevo. On the center, advancing Soviet troops hit the Dnieper defense line. On the left flank, Soviet rifle divisions were slowed as they entered forests southwest of Yelnya. Moreover, Soviet divisions were tired and depleted, at less than 60% nominal strength. On the 7th of September, the offensive was stopped, and the second stage of the Smolensk operation was over.